Hi guys, Molton here. Welcome back to another video in this new series on pawn formations. In this second video, I'm going to be talking about the King's Indian pawn structure, which is quite a common one, which you'll reach a lot in your games, and it can be reached from many different opening transpositions, not just from the King's Indian. So it's quite helpful to know how to play these positions from both colors, and I'll be presenting some ideas and general themes that you can pick up on in this particular video. So stick around to the very end and you should learn a few things along the way. As always, if you learned something from the video, do feel free to leave some comments down below and like and subscribe if you want to see more regular content. Otherwise, I'll jump straight into the video. I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, so let's start things off by looking at the pawn structure we reach in this particular middle game, and it's usually categorized by black having the pawn on e5, pawn on d6, and white will have this pawn on e4 and pawn on d5. Now, usually whichever way your pawns face is generally the direction in which you should be trying to seek counterplay. This is like a very easy way if you're not sure what plan you should be going for. Since white's pawns sort of lead towards the queen side, generally we will see that white will start to generate queenside counterplay with c4, b4, and eventually try to get in this pawn break, pawn to c5. Whereas black often goes for kingside counterplay with the move pawn to g6 and then pawn to f5, as we shall see. Sometimes white can capture and then black will also recapture with the pawn. So this is the pawn structure we will have a look at. So let's have a look at some examples now. From the black side, the most popular way of reaching this is of course through the King's Indian defense, and it's reached by these moves. After black fianchettos on the king side and castles, white often develops all these pawns to the center and then castles his king towards the king side. So we have pawn to d5. Here we see the pawn structure we discussed before, blocked up in the center. Knight b to d7, white castles in this position. Black plays the move pawn to a5. Now in general, you don't want to touch the queenside pawns so much unless you have some specific idea in mind, such as to slow white down from pushing these queenside pawns up the board, or maybe to make a square for your knight. In this case, black is trying to make a square on c5 for his knight. So he plays the move pawn to a5. Pawn to h3 was played from white. I think this might be a slight mistake or slightly too early because it does weaken this f4 square quite a bit. And we'll see a typical idea for black in these positions is to play the move knight h5 and then bring the knight into the f4 square, as we shall see. So knight c5, the bishop dropped back to c2 in this particular game, and here black played the move knight f to d7. So one of the most effective plans which you should go for is to push your f pawn up the board. So as we discussed before, because our pawns are locked up this way, we want to push the pawn up to f5 and perhaps even to f4 if we get the chance to do so. From here, black will be able to create a pawn storm on the king side and get some attacking chances going. So we have the move pawn to a3. Now we have to watch out for the move pawn to b4 in this position because white is trying to go for this c5 pawn push, but at the moment the rooks are pinned, so there's no b4 coming anytime soon because black would just take it and the rook would be left undefended here. So black continues with the move pawn to f5. So in this particular game, the white played the move bishop to g5. Now if white captures here, sometimes you can capture with the bishop as well, but most often I would say we capture back with the pawn, and this controls the e4 square and also opens up some lines later on, like we have the open g file to attack the white king with. So this is going to be a lot more helpful. In most cases you recapture back with the g pawn. Now in the game, white played the move bishop to g5, and after bishop to g5 we have the move bishop to f6. Now this dark squared bishop is not actually such a great piece in the King's Indian defense. It's a piece which is often blocked by these pawns, so unless this diagonal opens up somehow, most of the time this bishop is going to be locked inside the pawn chain, and trading the dark squared bishops off is actually quite beneficial for black in most cases. So here, that's why white declines the exchange and just drops back, but this allows black to continue on with the plan. So remember, the plan is to play the move pawn to f4. It may look counterintuitive because we're sort of blocking our bishop up, but there's no way for us to have traded off these bishops anyway. I mean, if we could have traded these bishops off first before blocking the position up, then we may have gone for that, but here we get a tempo by chasing the bishop, so that's okay. Here black plays the move knight to b6, so we'll see another idea in this position for black to sort of slow white down on the queen side. First we play the move knight to b6, attacking this pawn on c4, so gaining a tempo here because white has to defend it with either b3 or queen e2. I think b4 is tempting, but it doesn't quite work because I think after the captures, black might have something like this and then knight a6, attacking both pawns at the same time and leaving white with a difficult choice of which one to defend. Of course, playing a move such as b5 would allow black to just come back to c5, and this would secure a really good square and also kill off pretty much all counterplay for white on the queen side. So white doesn't want a situation where he has no more pawn breaks on the queen side, because then black will just push through on the king side and win. So queen e2, and here black plays a move which is very important and something you should always keep in mind to try and slow your opponent down, and that is the move pawn to a4. Very useful move here, and it sort of highlights perhaps white's inaccuracy in the opening, because now he's unable to play b4 because we have a special move in chess, and that's the move en passant, capturing this pawn. So he's not able to play b4, which means it's very difficult for him to play c5. So white goes knight to a2 in this particular game. Black continues on with his plan of kingside pressure by playing the move pawn to h5. So we see that we first play this f5 move, we close things up with f4, and then we go for a direct pawn storm on the king side. At the same time, we're trying to close things up on the queen side. So these are sort of the general plans for black. Bishop to b4, pawn to g5, knight to h2. Now, black can take it slow here and try to play g4 slowly, but if he, let's say, play queen e8 to defend the pawn on h5 because it's being attacked by the queen, then white might decide to play the move pawn to f3, and even though black can continue on, let's say queen g6 and maybe move the king, bring the rook across, he might not be able to get g4 in as easily as he would like, because this is a lot of defenders on this g4 square. So instead black decides that it's worth giving up a pawn, so he just plays the move pawn to g4 straight away, takes, knight takes, and drops the bishop back. And this is a common theme in these positions, where sometimes it's good to just sacrifice some material to get some open lines. Here we get so open h file and semi-open g file to attack our opponent with, so the queen is looking for these squares. f3 was played, and black plays move king f7. Also another common idea to move the king to f7 and chuck the rook across to the h8 square to start a kingside attack. White played the move pawn to g3 in this particular game. We have the move rook to h8, king to g2. We see that since the center is closed, it's very difficult for white to open things up at the moment, and so the king on f7 is relatively safe. We have the move queen to g5, rook to h1, and black played the move bishop takes g4. Pawn takes. I should also mention that this bishop, even though most often it doesn't really do anything for most of the game, it is quite useful later on for mainly getting in this g4 pawn push, or sometimes even sacrificing it for a kingside attack, say on h3, to break open white's kingside completely. So just keep in mind that that light square bishop, even though it's not doing anything for most of the time, it's quite useful later on. So black played the move king e7, rook to f1, we have the move rook to f8, rook takes, rook h1 was played, we had an exchange of rooks, and pawn takes g3. So we see white's pieces here are unable to really do anything on the queen side because it's so closed up, and he hasn't been able to get in this c5 pawn push, whereas black has managed to get a lot of counterplay on the opposite side of the board. So bishop h6, but this pawn on g3 is very strong as well, so the game continued like this, and here black starts to invade with the queen. So the queen enters via h1 and is looking to attack some of the queenside pawns here. Bishop f4, queen h3, knight g5. Very interesting move. Just he's not even interested in taking the pawn, because I think the c5 pawn was also hanging with check. Instead he wanted to play knight g5. The game continues on, and in fact queen g2 is a mistake. After queen g2, I think white just blundered a piece because it allows the capture, and then knight e1 check, and black went on to convert. But we see essentially what happened was black played the move pawn to g4, opened up lines, and then managed to get some pieces in to attack and put pressure, while white really never managed to get in any counterplay on the queen side for most of this game. Okay, let's have a look at another example. This one is from e4, e5, and we actually transposed from a Spanish, so this is why it's important to learn pawn structures, because you can get transpositions from all types of different openings. So here we have a Steinitz variation, delayed Steinitz. Knight f6, pawn to d5, captures, and again we get this pawn structure in the center. The only difference here is that black has actually traded off the light squared bishop, which, like I said, this light squared bishop can be helpful later on in terms of attacking white on the king side. So black has to be a little bit more careful since he's already traded this bishop off. Rook e1, pawn to g6, pawn to c4, bishop to g7, knight c3, castles. Now the plan shouldn't change for white though. The plan is exactly the same. Like I said, we're trying to play the move pawn to c5 to open up some lines on the king side. In fact, I think white can immediately play c5 if he wants to, because in this position, after the move pawn takes, you could play the move knight takes e5 and then recapture this pawn, and that's a good trade for you because now black has got these double pawns, and you can attack the queen with tempo, and the queen comes back, you can bring the knight back, threatening to push the pawn up to e5. So this would be quite a good trade to play c5. Instead, white plays the move pawn to a4 first, which is also fine. After this, he plays the move pawn to a5, just gaining some space and preventing black from pushing his pawns up. Now the game continued, pawn to h6. And in this position, I mean, white has a number of different plans, but they should all really involve pushing for this c5 move, or b5 is also a possible continuation as well. So for example, you could play the move pawn to b4 here as white. Let's say black continues with f5, which was the plan we looked at in the previous game. You could play the move knight to d2. So I mean, black could continue on with f4, that would be fine. That would be similar to what we looked at before. With f4, and then white can continue, let's say, with b5 or c5 to try and get some counterplay on the queen side. And also this knight could reroute to the c4 square later on. And white can continue on with the move f3 to try and block things up on the king side. So this would be okay. You play like this. One thing I'll mention is that a mistake people often make is capturing on e4 too early, because after this capture, we'll see that this e4 square is quite important, and it's very difficult to get rid of this piece. So for example, let's say you play like this, you play knight f6, captures, rook takes, the knight comes to e4, you get some position like this where the knight is sitting on this e4 square, it's very hard to get rid of the piece, and white can sort of just keep protecting it with pawn to f3 and so on. And this is not really a position you want as black. It's quite comfortable. As white, it's very hard to get your attack going along the f file because everything is well protected. So try to avoid those positions if you can, unless you can challenge for the e4 square later on. But generally speaking, yeah, we want white to capture, so then black captures back with the g pawn, or we want to push f4. In the game though, white played the move queen to b3, attacking this pawn on b7, and after the move rook to b8, immediately went for some counterplay with the move pawn to c5. So this is the pawn break we talked about earlier. In this position, white is temporarily sacrificing the pawn, but he's going to win it back. For example, if captures, we have bishop e3. There's no way for black to defend the pawn. White will play the move knight to a4 next if he needs to, and for example, if b6, we can even just capture the pawn right away because of this pin. Black can't capture it because it loses the rook. So white will win the pawn back on his next move regardless. King h7 was played, we have bishop to e3, our pawn takes c5, and then white plays the move knight to a4. Okay, knight to d6 was played, knight takes c5, the queen goes back to d8, queen a4, and the game continues on, but we can see that white's a little bit faster already in this particular game because black has not managed to get in the move f5, and white has already played the move c5. His pieces are quite active and he has a lot of threats. In fact, black still can't play f5 because knight e6 is coming next move. So it's already very, very pleasant for white, and white went on to win this game in a nice fashion. So now that we sort of see the ideas from both sides, let's look through a few sort of like examples you can try out yourself, and also some transpositions I'll show you from slightly irregular pawn structures. Okay, so let's start with this particular position. So it's white's playing this position. If you want to pause the video and try to work out what to do here, you can do so. Okay, so if you had a go at this position, then the correct move is to play pawn to c5. So remember we talked about this pawn to c5 move in the previous example. White wants to always go for this pawn push. In this particular case, if he doesn't play c5 right away, it's actually going to be quite difficult for him to play c5 later on. So for example, if he castles, then black plays, let's say, pawn to b6, and then let's say you just play some moves, black might continue creating a bind on these squares, on these dark squares, and in fact you might find that it's very, very difficult to get any counterplay at all. So actually maybe it's better to play a5 first. That might be a better way to do it, and afterwards, yeah, black will continue on with the knight coming to this square. Now, as we'll see, if you don't do this, let's say you try and go for a kingside attack instead. Let's say b6, white plays the move knight to d2. Let's say black plays the move knight here, knight comes here. Let's say knight comes here, and let's say white decides, okay, I'm going to go for a kingside attack. Well, he plays the move rook to g3. Then let's say black plays pawn to f5. Pawn takes, bishop takes. Now, it might look like you're attacking on the king side here, but in fact, like I said, you're also playing on the wrong side of the board in this case. Remember, black actually is quite favorable in the king side in this particular case, and there's really no pieces for white to really support the attack. So sometimes if you're playing on the wrong side of the board, you might run into a lot of trouble as well, and this is a good example of that. So just be aware of the plans, and the moves will come a lot more naturally. So here, for example, after move pawn to c5, if black captures, then we capture on e5. If rook to e8, then we can support our knight with the move pawn to f4. And there's actually no way for black to easily get rid of this knight. And now we have these two very strong pawns in the center. For example, if black tries to exchange the knights off, then we can castle and then push through with e5, bishop f3, supporting our pawns in the center with a very nice position for white. Okay, the next example I want to show was actually from a game of one of my students, and we reached this very interesting position here where the pawn structure is actually resembles more of a Benoni or perhaps a banker with no pawn yet on e4. But as we shall see, the position actually changes very, very quickly from a Benoni banker to a King's Indian. And this is where it becomes a little bit more relevant for us. Here white plays the move pawn to e4. And black, in fact, didn't take the pawn. Black just played the move pawn to h6. And white played the move bishop to d2. We have the move castles. And here white played the move knight to e1 to go for f4. In fact, I think maybe knight h4 might have been a better try, because remember we talked about earlier that this knight is often quite effective to go towards this f5 square, especially if they push their h pawn up the board. So for example, let's say knight e8, you could bring the knight into the f5 square, and taking here doesn't really help us because that would open up that bishop we said wasn't so great for white. Okay, but in the game we have to move knight to move knight to e1, and here black played the move pawn to a5, and personally I think this is a bad move because of the reason I mentioned earlier, and that is black's plan is to really open up on the queen side and not close things up. So I think it feels more natural to play a6 and then to play b5 and try and open up some lines on the queen side. That's what I would be leaning towards. But instead black played the move pawn to a5, and after a4, Stockfish doesn't actually like this move right away, but as a human I feel that blocking up everything on the queen side makes a lot of sense, because it stops immediately all black's counterplay, and we can go for our pawn push with the move pawn to f4. Now the game continued, bishop to d7, and here white should just immediately go pawn to f4 perhaps, but start out with the move pawn to h3, which is also okay. Knight h7 and then pawn to f4. Queen to c8 was played, which is actually a mistake, but if black captures, remember, what do we recapture with? Should we recapture with the rook, the bishop, or the pawn in this position? So the correct answer is to recapture with the pawn. So we always want to maintain control over this e5 square and then gain this open g file to use later on. But in the game, queen c8 was played, and then this is actually a mistake because it gives white the opportunity to get the position that we are aiming for, and that is the move pawn to f5. Okay, queen d8 was played, so black is trying to trade off this bad bishop with the move bishop to g5. So white move kills off this plan completely for black. It is the move pawn to h4. So in this position, if you play the move pawn to h4, you completely cut out this g5 plan. So the bishop is permanently bad because it's stuck inside the pawn chain, or pawns on dark squares. Also, this knight is very restricted, and white has a very, very simple plan here. I mean, we just want to push through g4. For example, let's say black plays some move. We could chuck our knight into this square, and then eventually we want to try to play g4, g5. So maybe we have to defend this pawn first, and then let's say black does something like this. We bring the queen across to g3, and then slowly but surely we will eventually organize a g5 pawn push to win the game. Maybe we will bring the king across to the queen side or the center of the board to make it a little bit safer. And then maybe we'll organize the rest of our pieces, maybe bring our other rook towards the king side to help support the pawn push. But eventually we will play g5, and that's how white will break through. So this is the problem, because everything is closed up on the queen side. Black has no real counterplay, whereas white will just push through on the king side. So in fact, in the game, things went a little bit different. Knight to g5, and white made some mistakes here, but h4 here, going for the type of position I mentioned, would have been much stronger. And here white can again organize some sort of attack, with bishop e1, and try to push through g5 and so on with a big initiative. Now, so as you can see, in this particular game, the position started out very irregular, but the pawn structure eventually transposed back to something we were more familiar with. So just keep this in mind when you're playing your games. Whenever you recognize this pawn formation crop up, remember the plans I outlined here. So that's all for this video. In the next one, we're going to go through another fairly common one that you can reach from King's Indian positions, which is the rouser. So until then, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.